Hilchis Mechirah Perek Shishasa. So we're learning the halachas of a mekach tois. Now we learned before that if you sell someone an item and that item has a mum, and that mum, it's normal for that Medina, and Medina they made up that such a mum is considered a mum which you could give back the item, so the lekeach could give back the item, and the meicher has to reimburse him with the money that he took from him. Now here we're learning about a mum. Normally in a regular mum, the pashas, the meicher knew about the mum. He sold him an item that had a mum, and now the lekeach realized there's a mum, so he's asking for the money back. There could be a mitzvah, a person selling an item, and he had no idea that there was a mum. In other words, he's selling seeds to plant. Now, as far as he's concerned, these seeds are regular seeds. Lepel, the person that bought it, went ahead and he planted these seeds, and they didn't grow. So the din is also that since Lepel, he sold these seeds in order to plant, and Lepel, they didn't grow, so therefore the buyer could turn back to the seller and say, listen, I bought an item, it's a mekach toy, so therefore I want my money back. But that's nafka if we're dealing that the pashtus advarms, that these seeds are being bought to plant. Mashengan, if these seeds could be bought to eat, so therefore the lekech, the meicher could say to the lekech, listen, these seeds are also ready for edible. So memela, there's no hechrich that this sale was a sale which was made to plant. Perek shishas. Hameicher zeroinigin, a person sells seeds of a garden, she'ein atzma shel zereinim nechel, which they themselves are not edible, and he sold it l'chavere. And lepel v'leit samcho, they didn't grow. So the din is chay b'achriyusam, the meicher is chay b'achriyusam, and therefore, he has to return the money that he took from the buyer. Why? The pastus is that these seeds are for planting. That's the pastus. They're not edible, so for planting. That's only, he planted it, and somehow or another the seeds didn't grow. So there was obviously something faulty about the seeds. There was a hail on the ground, and therefore they didn't grow. Why? Because Shema machmus haborad litzomchu v'chein kol kiyetze b'zeh. Those pashtus seeds grow. Mele, if lepela didn't grow, and there's no other factor to assume why it didn't grow, so we assume that it was a faulty seed. Masha'enkin, if there was another factor which we could assume that was the reason why it didn't grow, so Mele, we assume, we go back and we say the seeds of a pashtus are a good seed. Elamai, it didn't grow, there was other factors involved, there's nothing to do with the seeds, and therefore you can't tie in a mekach. That's talking about, you told him, Zereinim she'ein atzmum shel zereinim necholim. However, halacha beis, mochel izroim ha-necholim, you sold him seeds which could be eaten, kegen chitim us'edim, and lepel v'zor and v'leit somchu, he planted them and they didn't grow, is ein chay b'achriyusin. Nafilo hoye zera pishton, even we're talking about flax seeds, shereiv b'nei odom kein neso l'zriya. Most people buy the flax seeds not to eat, but to plant. Aber heil v'echlon neso, since there are people that eat it, because lepel, he says that lepel, you could have eaten it. In other words, it's not mukhrach that the sale was a sale to plant. It's not a question of das. It's not a question of what he sold it for. In other words, since lepel, it's possible that this buying was for achila. In the selling lick that it's possible for him to eat it. So therefore, you can't say you sold me an item which I have no use for, because lepel, you have a use for it. You could have eaten it. The fact that you chose to plant it, that does make a difference. However, if he told him shehu keina lezera, that he's buying it in order to plant, is chay b'achriyusin. So in other words, if there's another use for it, so the question is, did he buy? What did he buy it for? So in other words, if he bought it l'refuah, he bought it l'tzviyah, and then it didn't work, so then we say that since it didn't work for what he bought it for, so therefore it's considered a mekach tois. If lepel, he sold him an item, which bepastus maybe it would be done for one item, but lepel, there could have been an option for him to do it for another item, like we said before, benegeh flax seeds. The pastus advarim is going to plant it, but he also had an option to eat it. So he's buying an item which lepel, the pastus advarim could be used for one thing, but lepel, it could be used l'refuah, could be used l'tzviyah, and if he would have used it for that, it would have been a good item. So then, all these cases, we say that it's not considered a mekach tois. The l'tzviyah and the refuah could be words both ways. Either it's bepastus l'tzviyah l'refuah, and that's the only way that it's going to be, and therefore, if it didn't work, so therefore it is a mekach tois or fakert. If it's bepastus for something else, and it could be used l'tzviyah l'refuah, even though that's not the regular, nevertheless, that causes that it shouldn't be a mekach tois. Mikan atul halacha gimel. Mikana Tolamit. Now the Ram is learning another thing. You have to know where's the Mikana Tolamit. It's not so clear. Mikana Tolamit. Shekola lekeach mechaveri mekach. A person buys something from someone, and v'heidiya ishu milichi lemdina plainis lemachrisha. That the purpose of buying it is in order to bring it. He's going to transport it to some Medina. He's going to sell it there. Now once he brought this item to that place, is nimtza b'mum. There's a mum. Now the question is, for sure he could return the item and get back the money. The question, does he have to return the item, or he could just notify the seller that there was a mum and therefore he should reimburse him, and if he wants the item, let the seller go and get the item. So we're learning over here is eine yochel lemer. So the seller can't tell to the buyer, hazeli mikhilikam, bring me back the item that I sold you, and then only then will I reimburse you. The seller has to give the buyer the money, and then the meicher has to go ahead and be metapel and bring it back. Now, where's the Mikana Talamet? So the Ramar brings from the Aruch HaShulchan, the Pshat is as you sold him an item al manas to plant. Lepel, he planted it, and it didn't grow. So the question, now he's coming and asking for the money back. So Lepel, the seller has to give the money back. Lechura, where's the seeds? He could say, give me back the seeds. Those seeds that I sold you, give it back to me. It doesn't say that he has to give him back any seeds. Lepel, since he planted it, so and it didn't grow, it didn't do what he was supposed to do, so that's it. So he could ask for his money back. So Al Derazeh, if he brought it to a different place, so also he could ask for his money back. It's like not so clear because Lechura, if the seeds were planted and they didn't grow, the seeds disintegrated. We don't assume that the seeds are still around, and the question is who should dig them up and bring it back to the seller. I'm not really sure. But I'll call upon him, that's how he learns. That's the Mikana Talamet. Mikana Talamet, and it's clear in the Rambam that the Mikana Talamet is that the buyer doesn't have to transport it to the seller. It's the seller's obligation to transport it back. And he's saying, where do we know that from? We see from the fact that even though he planted it, he doesn't have to bring it back to the seller. He could tell the seller about it, and that's the seller. If the seller wants those seeds, so he could get it back. No. That vafilo avad enignav achasheidiyeh. Now, once the buyer goes and tells the seller that these seeds were faulty, and therefore you have to reimburse me, and those seeds are yours, and if you want to go take it, so now from there onwards is harei b'rshus hamecher. It becomes b'rshus hamecher. It becomes b'rshus hamecher, and therefore the mecher is responsible for it if something happens to it. If he doesn't notify him that he's going elsewhere, and he brought it there, so then it's harei b'rshus lekeach at sheyachzer hamecher b'mum lemecher. So the difference is if he notified him that he's transporting it. So then if something happens in the place where he transported it, so the moicher has to go ahead and bring it back. However, if he didn't notify him, so then it's the lekeach's obligation to bring it back to the moicher. So l'chura the second din is pashut. L'chura the second din is pashut. The chiddush is the first din. Then if he didn't notify him, he doesn't have to return it. L'chura, that's the way we're learning pshat based on this Aruch HaShulchan. Halacha dalet halekeach mekach v'nimtze b'mum. So Lepel, he bought something, and there was a mum, so really he could return it to the mecher, but before he got a chance to return it to the mecher, it was stolen. Now at that point in time, after there was a mum, he has the din of a shem esachar. So Mele is chai b'gnei v'aveda. So therefore, harei b'shus halikeach, ad sheyazra mekach lemecher, and the Mele, he's responsible. Even though he's able to return it to the mecher, but until he returns it to the mecher, he's responsible. Now this is talking about if what happened was that it was nignaf, or ovat. However, if it became faulty, it became ruined, rotten, because even though l'chura, he's a shemer sacher on it, but the fact, even if he would have returned it, so then the moicher anyways wouldn't have been able to do anything. That's how the Sma explains. That knows, in the case where it was nigna ve'avad, could be if he would have returned it to the moicher, it wouldn't have been nigna ve'avad. Or pashtus, masha'inkin, if it was a sliya, so even if it would have been b'rshus hamecher, it also would have been a sliya. So therefore, that's not his fault, and therefore it's b'rshus hamecher. If he should have told the mecher about the matzav, and he didn't tell him, and could be that's what also the Sma adds, that if he would have told him, so could be the mecher would have been able to make sure that this doesn't happen to his sliya. maybe use it before it gets to be a sliya, so then is Areza B'Rishus Lekech. So B'Kitzer, normally it's B'Rishus Lekech, and therefore, if it was Nignu Ze'avad, it's B'Rishus Lekech. Lepel, if it was a sliya and really nothing could have been done about it, so then it's B'Rishus HaMecher. Masha'inkin, if he should have notified the Mecher, and as a result of that, the Mecher would have been able to prevent this loss, and he didn't, so then it's B'Rishus HaLekech. Halacha Hey. HaMecher Sher Lechavere, V'nimtze Yatnachon. And Lepel, he doesn't want to have a share nakon because he wants to use the share for charisha, for plowing, and if it's a nakon, it's not going to work. Is yochel lemerle, so the seller could tell to the buyer, l'shchita mechartav, I sold it to you l'shchita. In other words, since there's an option of l'shchita, I don't think it's not a question of what the das was, what the das of the mecha with the gas lekech. The point is over here, he kataina that Lepel in this sale lies an option for l'shchita, and memela, so therefore you can't have any tinus. He was a lekech which buys for both. And even though he mostly buys lecharisha, but nevertheless, since he also buys leshchita, so therefore in hilchim mamanach harev. If it's known that he only buys lecharisha, so then it's areza mekachtois v'chezer v'chein kol kietz v'zeh. So now, since this specific lekech is someone that only buys lecharisha, he doesn't buy leshchita, so therefore it has the din of a mekachtois. Halacha vav, hamecher behema lechavera l'tficha. He sells a behema to shecht, and v'shochta lepel, the buyer shechted it, v'nimtzas treifa. So it's a mum. In other words, he sold it to him to shecht, he wants to have basar to eat, he can't eat it. So then there's im neide bevade, shoysa treifa k'shalocha, if it's clear that it became a treifa before he bought it, it didn't become a treifa between the buying and the shchita, so the din is hareza marzele sashchuta, he returns to him the geschachten animal, and v'yazer ha-mecher is adam, and the mecher returns the dam. Now lepel, there was a mum, it was a treifa. But now that it's shachut, it's even a bigger mum. Because lepel, you have meat, which is a shachut, which is a treifa. In other words, if you wouldn't have shechted it, could be the behemoth would have been worth more. You could have still been able to work with it, the viola with it. The behemoth was still usable. Mashenkin, now that you shechted it, so really you caused it to be in a worse situation. And nevertheless, lepel, you're not responsible for the fact that you shechted it, because lepel, how should you know? You bought it al manas l'shechted, and therefore you bought it al manas l'shechted. So therefore you get reimbursed for the animal, and you're not responsible at all the fact that you made the animal worth less. That's what he's saying. Now mikan atolamet, from here, this din will learn out from the fact that if someone sells you an animal al manas l'shecht, and you go ahead and shecht it, and it's found to be a treifa. So basically, you made the animal worse. But lepel, you're asking for your money back because lepel, you had no intention of shechting a treifa. So the din is mikanat olamet. From here we learn shahamecher davar shahoyim mum b'mkar. You sold something which had a blemish, and then v'osabei lekech mum acher, and now the lekech when he did another mum keid m'shiyivadli mum arishin before he knew about the first mum. So that's it. Im osa davar shedarka lasese. It's something which is normal for him to do. He knows he bought an animal and then he went ahead and shechted it. So really the shchita is making another mum. So then it's potter. Why? Just like over here, he returns the item as is and he takes back all his money. He's not responsible for the fact that he took this treifa and made it worse, that he shechted it. However, he made another mum, but that's not the mum that really he was expected to make. So lepel, there was a mumarishin. Because of the mumarishin, he's able to ask for his money back. But on the other hand, since he made a mum sheni, so that mum sheni, he's damaging the item of their seller. So they have to make a cheshbon. In other words, he gets his money back of how much he paid b'shas the sale, but then you have to deduct that because he's lepel, he was mazik. So that's the vimshin of asa mum acher kedem sheivadoli amumarishin. So the din is marzir amekach lebolov. So the original owner gets back the item, but he, the person, the buyer, has to go ahead and reimburse the seller for the mum that he made. In other words, the seller has to reimburse the buyer for the item that he sold him a faulty item, and the buyer has to reimburse the seller for the mum that he made to him. Halacha zayin kana beged. He buys beged means a big piece of cloth. Vikare, and then he cut it up. Lasis mimenu choluk, to make a shirt from it. And v'acharkach, after he cut it up to make a shirt, is noida hamum machmas akriya. As a result of cutting it up, he realized the mum that there is in this beged. So the din is machzor l'sakroim. He returns him the torn pieces, and he gets the money back. He gets all his money back. He's not responsible for the crime because that was the deal. The deal was he's going to take this beged, he's going to make a choluk from it. So obviously he's going to have to tear it up. Now tofrei. Let's say a person went ahead and sewed a choluk out of this beged. Out of this, he bought a piece of cloth, and he went ahead and made from this piece of cloth a beged, a chaluk, and then he realized that this beged is faulty, that the item is faulty. Tofrei v'achar kach neida amum is image biach. If he was mashbiach the item, is neitel shvachat tfirim and atever v'chein kol kietz b'zeh. In other words, let's say he bought an item for 10. He bought a piece of cloth for 10, and lepeil, this cloth was faulty. He didn't realize the fault until after he made the chaluk. But lepeil, he paid 10 for this chaluk, for this piece of cloth, and lepeil right now he bought a piece of cloth. He went ahead and made from this piece of cloth a piece of clothes. He bought the piece of cloth for 10, and lepel, the piece of cloth was faulty, and he found out that it's faulty after he made a piece of clothes from it. So the din is now lepel, since it was faulty, so it's really only worth 8. It was really only worth earthweight. So the first thing is he goes back to the seller, and he tells him, "Listen, you sold me a piece of cloth for 10. Lepel was faulty. I want all my money back. I want my whole 10 back." So now it gets back to 10. Now lepel, he took this piece of cloth, which was really the seller's, because he has a right to give it back to him, because it was a mekach toys, and lepel, he was mashbiachet. So therefore he could ask also from the seller money for the fact that he sold for him a piece of clothes. It's not a piece of clothes, it's not a perfect piece of cloth. But lepel, this piece of cloth, whatever it's worth, is worth now more. So for that extra worth that it's worth now more, so the seller, which went ahead and sewed this piece of cloth, is entitled to be reimbursed for. That's this din. Let's read it again. Kana beged. Person buys a beged v'kari lasis menu choluk, and v'achar kach neida amu machmus akriya. So machmus akriya. So then he gives him back the kroy and he gets all his money back. Now tofrei. First he went ahead and sewed this piece of cloth, and v'achar kach neida amu, and now he realizes the mum is image biach. If he made this item being worth more, so that is netel shvachat tzvira min ha-meicher. So he takes from the meicher. Besides the fact that he could tie it to the meicher mekach toys, because lepel was a faulty piece of cloth, so he also could tie it from the meicher that he wants to have, the shvachat tzvira. V'chein kol kietz b'zeh. That's this thing. Halacha ches. Ha-meicher karka l'chaveri. A person sells a piece of karka to someone, and lepel, that buyer is ochel perisel. So the buyer of the karka realizes there's a mum in the karka, and as we said, that even though ain't no karkois, but there is a little of mekachtois, is imrotza lahavze karka lebailim. If this likech has the right to exercise his rights to taina that it's a mekachtois and return the karka to the bailim. So if he wants to do that, he could do that. But on the other end, mazu kolaperis. So that'll going to come out of afraid that it was never his, and therefore he has to return all the payers he ate. However, v'imhoye and not however, v'imhoye chotzer v'darba, and a lepel was a chotzer and he lived in the chotzer, and normally living in someone else's chotzer you have to pay rent, is sorech la'alis l'schar. So in other words, he has the right to tiny mekachtois. But on the other hand, once he's going to tiny mekachtois, so mafrei was never his, so mainly he's going to have to either pay for the payers that he ate or for the rent that he didn't pay. Halacha tes. Hamecher davar sheyesh b'mum she'eini nira. Sells an item which has a mum, it's eini nira. And lepel is ovad hamekach machmas esi amum. As a result of that mum, which the lekech wasn't aware of, the mekach was lost. Is areza machzeres adams. Now we learned before in halacha daled that if you buy a mekach and it has a mum, and then it was ovad inanas, so then it's b'rshus lekech. The lekech is responsible. So even though it had a mum, and lepel he could return the item and be reimbursed. But on the other end, if he didn't return the item, so then the item is b'rshus halekech and he's responsible. That's what we learned before. But medvar mamurim, he had a mum, and lepel he knew about the mum, nimtza b'mum, and then it was avadei ganav because whatever he lost it. So then the din is that the lekech is responsible. But over here, if it went lost because of the mum, and the lekech didn't know about the mum, so then the lekech is not responsible. That's his din. Like we'll soon see that the example. Hamecher davar sheyesh b'mum she'eini nira. He sells him an item which has a mum which you can't see the mum. And lepel v'aved hamekach machmas esi hamum. And as a result of that mum, the mekach went lost. Is areza machzer sadom. So then the seller has to reimburse the lekech all the money. Ketzat hamecher she'el lechaver she'el technis. He sells him an ox that doesn't have teeth. And Lekech wasn't aware of that. He put him together with all his other animals. And he assumed that all of the animals are eating. And he didn't realize that this animal is not eating. The animal died of hunger because it didn't eat. You have to give him special food. So the din is so the buyer, which wasn't aware of this, could return the nevela to the seller. And v'yaz is zadom, and the seller is going to have to reimburse him the money. Because lepel, the fact that it went lost as a result of this mum that the meicher had, which was b'shus hamecher, and the lekech wasn't aware of. Now that's talking about the meicher was aware of the mum, and the lekech wasn't aware of the mum. So then the meicher is responsible. Now hoya meicher sarsur shelekech mizel meicher lezeh. He was a middleman. Because he puts together a seller and a buyer, but lepel he buys it from the seller and he sells it to the buyer. And so he doesn't really hold on to schera. He buys it from one and he sells it to the other. And he wasn't really aware of this mum. So now the question is, who should be responsible for this mum? Lepel, the behemoth died. The behemoth died. So there was a seller that sold the item to the sarser, and then the sarser sold the item to the buyer. So Hari Asarso Nishba Shvos Hesses Shaliyada Mibumza. The Sarso swear Shvos Hesses that he wasn't aware of it. V'yipoter, why? But Lepel the Lekech bought an item that he wasn't aware of. Mipnei Shahoya la Lekech livdik asher bifnei atzmei ulachzir leked mishiyomus. Since he's buying it from a Sarsur, so therefore there's no one really taking serious responsibility on it. So therefore he should have inspected it. And then he should have inspected it, and before the behemoth actually died, and then the sarsu machzir ala mesarishin, and then this middleman would have given it back to the original seller. Since the buyer didn't do that, in other words, when a buyer buys it from a sarsur, that's what he should have done. If a buyer buys it from a seller, even if we'll assume he should have done it, but the seller is responsible. So regardless if the buyer should have done it, but the seller knew about it, so the seller is certainly responsible. Mashengan over here, in the case where there's no seller that's responsible, the sarser is not really faulty, and the buyer should have been baidik, so therefore the sarser is potter. Via sarser hoyel v'le'asa is hu alikech hirsad alatzme v'chein kol ki'etzbes. So again, when you buy it from a seller, that the seller is himself at fault, so the fact that the lekech maybe should have inspected it is irrelevant. Mashenkin, in the case where the sarser is not really at fault, because Lepil, the Sarser, wasn't aware of it. And the Lekech is at fault because he should have inspected it. So then the Sarser is potter and the Lekech gets the loss. Halacha Yud Beis. Hashechet is abcher umochrei. V'nedolei shelehireu lemumche. The din is that abcher, even if it has a mum, so maybe you're really allowed to shecht it outside the Beis Hamikdash, but in order to shecht it with a mum, it has to be shown to a mumche. And if it wasn't shown to a mumche, so midrabanan, even though it had a real mum, nevertheless it's asr bahano midrabanan. So now this person went ahead and he shechted this bcher, and he sold it without showing it to a mumche. So the din is really had no right to sell it, and really it's asr bahano. Is masha achal achal, what this buyer ate, he ate, aber v'yazali hadom, still the seller, which had no right to sell this item, should reimburse him for the money of the item that he ate. And b'hanishim and abasa b'yad l'chuch, and whatever is left over of this bcher, it says here yikabel, but it should say yikover. It should be buried. It's asur b'hano. And also v'yazal misadom knows the seller has to reimburse the buyer for the entire bcher because he had no right to sell it. And Mamela, even though the buyer ate some of it, but lepel that's not deducted, he has to pay him back for the entire bcher. V'chein hashechet is apara. A person goes ahead and shechts apara. Umachra and v'neider she treifa. In reality, this para was a treifa. So the buyer really ate food which he really wasn't allowed to eat. In case the first case was asur bano, But over here, treifa is not also bano, but lepel, the buyer ate food which he shouldn't have eaten, is masha'achal, whatever he ate, or b'v'yazal sadam. In other words, you don't deduct, say, listen, I really shouldn't have sold you the item, but lepel, you ate it, so memela, so you had enough from it. We say no. The money that you paid for this item, you shouldn't have paid. It was a mekach toys, and therefore I have to return you the money. And the fact that you ate some of the item is not negea. Umashaleachal is yachzos abasal tabach. So the part that he didn't eat, he has to return to the seller, and v'yachzos sadam, and he pays him back again the money. So in other words, he gives him back all the money that he took from him. So as far as the food the stuff that he ate, he gives him back the money for the food that he ate, and as far as what he didn't eat, he has to return the item, and then he gives him back the money. Then it gives him back the money. Now, mach pashtus said, because we consider it like it's a knas on the moicher. That the pashtus advar. Halacha yud gimel. Mocher alikeach bases zeh shel treifel lenochrim, ei shehechilu leklavim. In other words, the buyer bought an item which officially was supposed to be kosher. In other words, it was originally meant to be kosher. And lepel, when he realized that it was not kosher, he went ahead and sold it to goyim, or he gave it to dogs. So the din is yichashiv madabach al dmei atreifa. In other words, like this. He sold him without any eating. There was no eating. He sold him a pcher which he shouldn't. He sold him a treifa. He sold him a piece of meat which he thought was kosher. He sold him a behema which he thought was kosher. It was a kosher geschachten the behema which he assumed is kosher. Lepel, they found out that it was treif. So what he could do is return the behema and take all the money. And the seller could go ahead and do whatever he does with the behemoth, because it's a treifa behemoth. You could sell it to a guy. Masha'enkin, if the buyer went ahead and sold it to a guy, so now, the seller has to reimburse the buyer for the money that he took from him. But on the other hand, he's going to deduct the money that the buyer got by selling it. In other words, Lepeli has to reimburse him the money that he took from him, but he reimburses him and also takes back the behemoth. Normally, he has to take back the behemoth and then reimburse him. Masha'in came over here, since the behemoth was sold to a goy, or he gave it to a kelev to eat, so Mamela, he makes a cheshbon with him. I have to reimburse you for the behemoth that I sold to you, which I shouldn't have. But Lepel, you already used that behemoth in order to sell it to a goy or lachila lekelev. So you had certain hana from it. So the money that I have to reimburse you, I deduct the hana that you got from it, either by selling it to a goy or being michael to a kelev, and the rest I have to give you. That's this din. Yeah. Rather than giving it back to the Mechir, is Yichashiv im hatabach al dmei atreifa. So he makes a cheshbon how much he owes him the dmei atreifa, and v'yavzel hatabach dmei atreifa knows how much it was worth to sell this treifa when he sold it to the guy, when he sold the treifa to the guy, or he sold it, or he gave it to the kelev, and v'yavzel hatabach sameis, and then he has to give back the rest. In other words, you deduct that from the original sale, and he gives him back the rest. V'chein kol ki yetzbasa. Halacha Yudalet. Hamecher basel lechavere v'nimtze psar pcher. He sells a meat, and later on we realize that it's psar pcher. Either it was mamish psar pcher that it was shchitas kotchen bachutz. That could be one option, or even if it wasn't shchitas kotchen bachutz, but a lepel, he shouldn't have sold it to him, even if it had a mum, but he didn't show it to a mumche. B'kitzer, it was something you weren't allowed to eat. You weren't allowed to eat, maybe even not allowed to have enough from it. Or peiros, he sold him peiros v'nimtzu tfolim. At the end of the bus tevel. Or yayin, he sold him wine v'nimtzu yayin nesach. And lepel, the person ate these peiros, or he ate this pcher. So the din is masha'achal achal. Even though he ate, v'yazul es adam. Lepel, the seller has to reimburse the buyer for the money they took from him, even though the buyer l'chura was nana, he ate from it. V'chein kol ha'mecher dover she'asa la'achli min ha'teira. Someone that sells an item which is asa la'achli min ha'teira, kachu dine ben she'hoye yisuri b'koris, ben she'hoye yisuri b'lav b'lvad, regardless of what madreg of the isur. But if it was asa min ha'teira and he sold an item and that buyer ate the item, lepel, he has to reimburse him, and he doesn't deduct because he ate the item. That's talking about when he sold him an item which is awesome and atera. If he sells an item which is only a Issa D'Rabbanon, is imhoyu aperis kayomim. If the peris was still in existence, is machzus aperis. So he can return the peris because the mekach toys v'netel is damav. However, v'im ochlam, if the buyer went ahead and ate the item which was only awesome D'Rabbanon, ochal, he ate, and then v'ein mecha machzer liklum. The mecher is not machzer liklum. Now, so knows if it was asim and atera, so then the mechir has to be machzir, because lepel, the fact that a person ate something which is asim and atera is not really considered ano. It's considered ano. It's nafshi kotzebe. It's something which he finds it repulsive, and memela it's not considered ano. Masha'inkin, if a person ate something which is considered only a Issa D'Rabbanon, so then that's considered a Hano. Lepel, he had Hano from it. It was Taka Osa, but it was had Hano. So if he didn't eat it yet, so he could return it. Masha'inkin, if he ate it already, so then what he ate and he can't ask to be reimbursed for what he ate. That's this din when it's Osir Be'achila. However, V'chol Yisuri Hano, if it was Osir B'Hano, Be'im D'Vriteir, Be'im D'Vrayim, so then Mazir is Adam, Ve'im B'em Dim Mechirah Klal. In other words, a person buys an item which is Osir B'Hano, so the seller had no right to sell it B'chlal. It was worthless. It had no value. So the money that you gave to the seller obviously has to be reimbursed, whether you ate or you didn't eat it, because he had no right to sell the item. When you sell an item which is Osir B'Drabanan, so he also wasn't allowed to sell it in such a way. But you can't say there's no sale, because Lepel, since it's only Osir B'Achila, so it has a value. So he sold it. He shouldn't have sold it, but he sold it. The sale is considered a valid sale. Masha'enk, when a person sells an item which be'etzim has no value, so that's not considered a sale. So Memela, that's why he always could be reimbursed. Now this din, that there's a difference between a Yisad Teiraisa, Yisad D'Rabbanan, that's the Yisod. This is the Yisod. This din is the famous Nesivis, that the Nesivis says that a Yisad D'Rabbanan, if a person was over in a Yisad D'Rabbanan b'shegig, he doesn't need a kapara. And the Hasbaras Advarim is because a Issa D'Rabbanan is only a Issa Gavra. There's no Issa on the Chefza. The Rabbanan didn't create an Issa that the Chefza should become a Chefza Shel Yisura. There's a pshat that you're not allowed to eat it because Lepel, there's a din L'Sosim not Davar Shegidu L'cha. It's based on the din, on the Gavra, that he has to listen to the Rabbanan. So Lepel, if he was over on, if a person's over on Issa D'Rabbanan b'mezid, so what's the Issa? The Issa is not the Achil of the Chefza. The Issa is the fact that he did something which was against the Rabbanan. Masha'enkin, if it was b'shegig, so he wasn't doing anything against the Rabbanan, and the food wasn't a Michael Shalisser, it was only an Os. It's not a Chefza Shalisser, it's only that it's also for you to do it because you have to listen to the Rabbanan. So b'chiyah gam, if you did it b'shegig, so you can't say you didn't eat. You did eat, and he goes even further, that it doesn't need a kapara. You know, they say this the Yisod, that a Isser D'Rabbanan is only a Isser Gavra, Masha'enkin, a Isser D'Raisa is a Isser Chefza, as a result of this halacha. And we discussed, I think, in the past, that the Rebbe once spoke by Arichos, that from the Alter Rebbe and Periches and Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe speaks about that Sholosh Klippus Atmeyas, Ve'ed Zeis B'macholas Asuris, that if a person ate something which was Asur, so it's Asur B'deach Yitzeinim, and Memele can't be oile even if the person learns and it does l'shem shemayim and he uses it for Avedis Hashem. And over there, the Alter Rebbe writes clearly, even if we're dealing with Yisud Rabbanan, there's vafilu Yisud Rabbanan shechmurim derisefra yesim deriteira. So the Alter Rebbe is learning that Yisud Rabbanan also has the din of Shalosh Klippus Atmeyos, which obviously means it's a Yisur Chefza. So the Rebbe spoke in Arichos that Alter Rebbe is learning taka that it's an Yisur Chefza l'chur, and not the way it's mashma over here from this Rambam. So obviously you have to have a different hesber in the Rambam. It's not because that the Chefza is not a Chefza Shel Yisura. It's Lepeil because some Kosof, since it was only Yisud Rabbanon, you have to explain the Havanas Advarim of why talk about Yisud Rabbanan, you could be reimbursed according to the Alter Rebbe.